British Columbia, a province not only of great natural beauty, but also one of the last strongholds of a remarkable group of fishes, the trout, salmon, and char. Along with whitefish and grayling, they are collectively called salmonids. To thrive, salmonids require clean cold rivers and rich ocean pastures, resources that are becoming scarce over most of the globe. Salmonids have existed in BC for millions of years. In fact, the oldest known salmonid is a 45-million-year-old fossil from a deposit at Driftwood Creek near Smithers. Today's species are relatively recent immigrants to the province. This is because periodically, over the last 1.5 million years, the province has been covered by a thick sheet of ice. In BC, there were at least 4 glacial episodes. During each glaciation, the province was covered in ice up to a depth of over 1 kilometer for thousands of years. The last glacial period in BC reached its maximum extent about 15,000 years ago. This was the Fraser glaciation. Only a few isolated mountaintops protruded above the ice, while at its edge, 2 small areas, one on the northeastern tip of the Queen Charlotte Islands and the other on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island, escaped this last glaciation. As the glaciers advanced, they scoured and reshaped the valleys. Any fish species using rivers and lakes were either wiped out or pushed into ice-free areas called refugia. As the ice retreated, melt from the glaciers formed connections between river systems in the scoured valleys. Large lakes formed behind huge piles of rubble called moraines. One minor source of our present fauna was the Bering Refuge. This refuge consisted of ice-free regions in the Yukon and Alaska. Only cold, hardy species survived in the Bering Refuge. It was the source of species such as the Arctic grayling, the inkanu, and the northern form of the chum salmon. The primary source of our fish fauna was the ice-free area south of the glaciers and west of the Rocky Mountains. Here the climate was more benign than the Bering Refuge, and therefore more species survived in this Pacific or Columbia Refuge. There were 2 routes into BC from this refuge. The coastal route opened relatively early in deglaciation, allowing saltwater-tolerant species such as the coastal cutthroat trout and the Pacific salmon to disperse upwards. The other route into BC from the Pacific Refuge was the interior route. Large glacial lakes formed first in the Okanagan and Columbia valleys, and later in the Thompson and northern Fraser valleys. These lakes drained south into the Columbia system and provided a dispersal route for fish into the interior of the province. A third major refuge was situated on the Great Plains. This refuge stretched from the Rocky Mountains east to the upper Mississippi Valley. As the ice retreated, a series of huge glacial lakes covered this area. At first, these lakes drained south into the Missouri or Mississippi rivers, but later drained north into the Mackenzie system. By understanding the glacial history of BC, we get a clearer picture of where current fish fauna came from and why some species occur in one part of the province and not in others. During glaciation, several species were pushed into more than one ice-free region and had no opportunity to interbreed with each other for thousands of years. This led to the presence of genetically different forms of the same species in different parts of the province. All salmonids spawn in fresh water. Some species are anadromous and migrate to salt water, while others complete their entire life cycle in fresh water. Many species have both anadromous and freshwater resident forms. Spawning begins with the female depositing her eggs in gravel. These eggs are then fertilized by the male and then covered for protection. The eggs remain in the gravel where they incubate. When the eggs hatch, they have huge yolk sacs that contain the nutrients they need to survive. They are called alevins, and they can hardly swim. At first they stay in the gravel and use the yolk for food. This protects them from most predators until they are mobile enough to emerge. When the alevins absorb the yolk sac, they emerge from the gravel as fry. At this time, they remain in shallow water and close to cover. Some forms stay in the spawning area, while others move to a main stem river, a lake, or directly into salt water. Salmonids feed during the day and actively at dusk and dawn. As the fry grow, they become juveniles or par. At this stage, many species develop distinctive barred patterns on their sides that help protect them and allow them to blend in with their surroundings. Juvenile habitat in streams differs depending on the species, but as fish grow, they move into deeper water. Also, their food requirements change and they gradually shift to larger prey. Those that move to the more open water of lakes or the ocean will lose their par marks. They develop counter-shaded patterns, their backs darken, and their bellies and sides become silvery. For anadromous species, this is the beginning of the stage when they migrate to sea. At this time, they are called smolts. Their life cycle will come full circle when they return from the sea to spawn in the gravel from which they emerged. After their journey to the sea and back to the stream to spawn, they die. The circle of life is complete, but this does not end their story. Their bodies contain nutrients, and as their corpses decay, these nutrients are released into the spawning stream and passed up the food chain. When the new fry emerge in the spring, they feed on the bounty created by the bodies of previous generations. Technically, salmonids belong to the family Salmonidae. This diverse family contains 5 distinctive groups of fish: Arctic grayling, whitefish, Pacific salmon, trout, and char. The differences between species in these 5 groups are sometimes subtle, and they can be difficult to identify, especially as juveniles. A mix of different information, such as par marks, number of fin rays, and size, is used to identify fry and juveniles. Knowing the geographic distribution of the various species also helps. Whitefish are part of a subfamily of salmonids called the Coregoninae. Of the 9 species in BC, most are in the north, although some, like the mountain whitefish, are found throughout the province. Whitefish differ from other salmonids in that their weakly developed teeth appear to be absent in adults. Their scales are also much larger than those found on other fish. Arctic grayling belong to the subfamily Thymallinae. The most striking characteristic of the grayling is its long dorsal fin. This fin is especially enlarged and colorfully marked in mature males. Salmon, trout, and char belong to the subfamily Salmoninae. This is the most diverse group within the salmonid family. The members differ in color, shape, size, and life histories. Nonetheless, they share some similarities. As adults, they are easily identified by color, especially when spawning. It is the younger stages that are more difficult to identify. The Pacific salmon are probably the most recognizable and most commonly observed of all salmonid species. There are 5 species of Pacific salmon in BC: the Chinook, chum, coho, sockeye, and pink salmon. This is the Chinook salmon, or Oncorhynchus shawitska. It is the largest of the Pacific salmon and can reach a weight of up to 120 pounds. In the U.S., it is often called the king salmon, and especially large individuals are called tai by fishing guides and lodge owners. At sea, adult Chinook have bright silver sides and dark blue-green backs, usually covered with scattered dark spots. There are also dark spots on both the upper and lower parts of the tail. The gums at the base of the teeth are black. This latter trait is the basis of another of the species' common names, blackmouth. Chinook can live for up to 8 years. They may migrate as fry to estuaries or spend their first 1 or 2 years as resident par in fresh water before heading to the ocean. Regardless of when they start their migration to the sea, they spend several months in estuaries before moving out to sea. Typically, they spend 2 to 6 years in the ocean before returning to the place where they were born. The timing of this return to fresh water is variable, with some populations returning in the spring, others returning in the summer, and still others returning in the fall. Despite this variation in time of return to their natal river, most populations spawn in the late summer or autumn. Although they are large animals, Chinook are often not easily seen when spawning. They prefer to spawn in deeper water and larger rivers than other Pacific salmon. Spawning colors in Chinook vary among populations but are not strikingly different between the sexes. In BC, most populations develop a dark maroon spawning color, but some populations take on an almost golden hue. This is the chum salmon, or Oncorhynchus chaeta. It is the second largest species of Pacific salmon. At sea, chum have bright silver sides and a dark blue back without spots. Also, there are no spots on the tail. Most southern populations of chum start to show spawning colors immediately on entry into fresh water. When spawning, the sexes are easily distinguished by their markings. Male chum have pale flanks with irregular yellowish and purple-black blotches. In contrast, females have a purple-black lateral stripe. Both sexes have enlarged bared teeth, although these are more prominent in males than in females. Perhaps the common name dog salmon was derived from these dog-like teeth. Southern populations of chum salmon migrate downstream soon after emerging from the gravel, but remain and grow in estuaries for 3 or 4 weeks before moving out to sea. Chum remain at sea for 2 to 6 years and then return to fresh water. Most southern populations make rather short migrations into fresh water, but others migrate for extraordinary distances. Chum may spawn any time from late summer to early winter. However, northern populations generally spawn earlier than southern populations. Spawning chum are easily spotted in shallow water, and their large size and markings make them particularly conspicuous. This is the coho salmon, or Oncorhynchus casuche. At sea, coho have bright silver sides and a blue-green back covered with scattered dark spots. They resemble small Chinook, but differ in that only the upper half of the tail is spotted and the gums at the base of the teeth are white. Spawning coho are conspicuously colored. Dominant males have striking red sides, the lower half of the head is black, and the upper jaw is strongly hooked. Females are similarly but less vividly colored, and the upper jaw is not as strongly hooked as in dominant males. Although brightly colored, spawning coho can be hard to locate. Many populations spawn at night in small streams and shelter during the day under cut banks or woody debris. Coho tend to spawn later in the year than other Pacific salmon, and, depending on the population, spawning occurs from October to January. A few populations spawn as late as March. In BC, most coho mature and spawn in their 3rd year. The fry remain in fresh water for their 1st year and migrate to sea after 1 winter of stream growth. However, some populations remain in fresh water for 2 years. Competition for space and other resources is especially strong during this stream-dwelling phase, and at this time, coho, fry, and parr are notoriously aggressive. This relatively long period of stream life makes coho particularly vulnerable to the activities that modify stream environments. This is the sockeye salmon, or Oncorhynchus nerca. At sea, sockeye have bright silver sides and a deep blue back. They lack the dark spots on the back and tail that are characteristic of coho and Chinook. The non-anadromous form of sockeye is called kokanee. Spawning colors in this species usually are vivid. The entire body except for the head turns bright red. The head turns green, and eventually the underside turns black. Females are usually less vividly colored than males. There are also striking differences in shape between the sexes. Males often develop a hooked upper jaw and an exaggerated hump or razorback, while females tend to retain their original shape. Sockeye tend to spawn synchronously in large aggregations, and their upstream migrations are characterized by strongly peaked runs and precise run timing. In systems like the Fraser, the runs to specific spawning tributaries start in June and continue into September. Sockeye usually spawn in streams that are closely associated with lakes. Characteristically, on emergence, sockeye fry migrate to a lake where they spend a year feeding offshore in open waters. In the case of anadromous populations, they migrate to the sea as smolts, where they spend 2 to 3 years feeding before returning to their home stream to spawn. This is the pink salmon, or Oncorhynchus gorbushka. At sea, pink salmon have silver sides and a blue-green back covered with widely scattered dark spots. They also have dark, elongated spots on both the upper and lower lobes of the tail. It is the smallest of the anadromous Pacific salmon. When spawning, pinks have a dark back and upper sides with purple blotches below the lateral line that grade off into a white underside. Males and females are similar in color, but differ dramatically in shape. Male pinks develop a hooked snout and enlarged teeth, but their most striking feature is their humped back. This hump is similar to the razorback found in sockeye populations, but is much more exaggerated. The hump is the basis of the alternative names humpback salmon or humpy. Pinks have the least variable life cycle of any of the Pacific salmon. They live 2 years, and most rivers have odd and even year populations, with the run in 1 year significantly larger than the run in the alternate year. In BC, runs begin entering rivers in late July, August, and September, and spawning occurs in September and October. Like sockeye, the runs tend to have strong peaks, and there are usually large aggregations crowded into relatively small areas. Spawning occurs in riffles or areas of fast-moving water. Depending on the population and incubation regime, the young emerge anywhere from late February to May. Upon emergence, the fry immediately migrate to sea and remain in the ocean for 2 years before returning to their home stream. Trout are the next group of the salmonids. Unlike salmon, which spawn in large groups in the fall, trout spawn in the spring, usually in smaller numbers. They often spawn several times, resulting in higher rates of survival. There are 2 native trout in BC, cutthroat and rainbow. Both species occur in a variety of forms. For example, in rainbow trout, there is the southern interior form called the Kamloops trout and a large anadromous form called steelhead. For cutthroat, there are 2 well-marked subspecies, the coastal and west slope cutthroat. This is the coastal cutthroat trout, or Oncorhynchus clarkii. The most distinctive characteristic of cutthroat is the red or orange slash under the lower jaws. They also have longer jaws and smaller scales than rainbow trout. The 2 subspecies that occur in BC have characteristically different spot patterns. Sea-run coastal cutthroat have silver sides and dark backs. The well-developed spots and colored jaw stripe of freshwater populations are difficult to see in fish fresh from the ocean. Once in fresh water, they quickly develop a greenish back and sides that are densely covered in conspicuous dark spots. In BC, sea-run coastal cutthroat enter freshwater in late summer, but usually don't spawn until December or even as late as March. They rarely aggregate on spawning grounds, but instead spawn as dispersed pairs, often in tiny or even ditched streams. At this time, the male develops an elongated snout that increases the length of the jaws. Spawning colors are variable in the coastal subspecies, but are usually not as obvious. Unlike Pacific salmon, cutthroat may spawn several times. They can live for up to 7 years. Upon emergence, the fry stay in their natal stream for at least a year. They are especially sensitive to competition at this stage and tend to shift from riffles into pools. The time of migration to the sea is usually less than 5 years. Although most tend to remain in salt water for only a few months, Some individuals may stay over winter, and others may even spend 2 years in the sea. The basic color of West Slope cutthroat is similar to that of coastal cutthroat. However, the dark spots are usually absent from the anterior flanks below the lateral lines and densely packed on the caudal peduncle. Spawning of this non-anadromous subspecies occurs in April and May. Spawning males are colorful and in many populations develop striking red bellies. This is the rainbow trout, or Oncorhynchus mycis. They lack the red slash under the lower jaw that is characteristic of the cutthroat. The upper jaw is shorter than that of a cutthroat, and they have larger scales. Most rainbow trout remain in fresh water all their lives, occupying streams, rivers, and lakes. Anadromous rainbow trout are called steelhead. At sea, steelhead are easily confused with coho and chinook. They have bright silver sides, dark blue backs, and dark spots on the back and tail. Rainbow trout spawn in the spring, from mid-April to June, depending on the location. The spots and the red lateral band that gives them their name are evident on spawning fish. Males develop a hooked snout, although not as prominent as in salmon, and have a larger head than females. Steelhead juveniles usually stay in streams for about 2 years before migrating to sea beginning in early spring and continuing to midsummer. In more northern rivers, it may take 4 years or more to reach migratory size. Interior steelhead adults commonly return to their natal streams during the period of June to October, dependent on water flow and destination. In contrast, coastal species return to natal streams between November and May. As both run types spawn in the spring, steelhead can spend up to 7 to 12 months in fresh water before spawning. Char are the last group of salmonids. They are commonly referred to as trout, even though they belong to the genus Salvelinus. The easiest way to tell a char from a trout is by the color of its spots. Trout have dark spots against a light background, while char have colored or light spots against a dark background. There are 3 native species of char in BC. This is the Dolly Varden, or Salvelinus mulma. At sea, they have silvery sides and a green back and upper head. The Dolly Varden gets its unusual common name from a Dickens character who habitually wore dresses with bright-colored spots. The Dolly Varden can be anadromous, although most populations are freshwater residents. They spawn in fall, and their fry emerge in March or April. Anadromous juveniles live in streams for 3 to 4 years before migrating to the sea. This is the bull trout, or Salvelinus confluentus. They have a more pointed snout, and usually the spots on their back are larger and more separated than in Dolly Varden. Without experience, it can be difficult to distinguish between bull trout and Dolly Varden. This is a case where geography helps. Bull trout are an interior species, while Dolly Varden are a coastal species. However, there are some exceptions to the rule. For example, in the Skeena system, Dolly Varden extend right to the headwaters, and in the Fraser system, bull trout occur downstream to the estuary. This is the lake trout, or Salvelinus namaycush. The tail is deeply forked, and there are light-colored spots on both lobes. Also, the head and body are covered in light, irregular spots. These fish can live up to 40 years and, as the name implies, spend most of their lives in lakes. Spawning times vary with latitude and are earlier in the north than in the south. The fry usually emerge in March or April. It is essential that we can recognize the many species of salmonids. In order to maintain a healthy ecosystem, we must understand the needs and requirements of these magnificent fish. Cold, clear water, plentiful food, cover, and finally, accessible streams make their lives possible. By protecting watersheds, we will be able to ensure that species that have survived for millions of years will be part of our ecosystem for generations to come.